On January 13, 1982, Air Florida Flight 90 prepared for departure from Washington National Airport, now Reagan National Airport. The plane was bound for Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and on board were 74 passengers and 5 crew members. The flight was supposed to be routine, but the blizzard outside told a different story. Washington, D.C. was covered in snow and ice. Heavy snowfall had blanketed the airport, causing major delays, low visibility, and dangerously icy conditions. Many flights were grounded, but Flight 90 was still scheduled to depart. The pilots, Captain Larry Wheaton and First Officer Roger Pettit, were experienced but had limited experience flying in extreme winter conditions. As the passengers boarded, they could see the snow piling up on the wings. The plane had already been de-iced, but the storm was relentless. Icicles hung from the fuselage, and freezing slush coated the runway. Some passengers felt uneasy, but they trusted that the pilots and ground crews knew what they were doing. After a long delay, the flight was finally cleared for takeoff. Inside the cockpit, tension was rising. The pilots knew that the engines had to be running at full power to lift off safely in these harsh conditions. But something was already wrong. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, ice continued to form on the wings and in the engine intakes. The crew failed to activate the engine anti-ice system, a crucial step in freezing conditions. This decision would prove to be a deadly mistake. The aircraft lined up on the runway, and the pilots pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared, and the Boeing 737 began its takeoff roll. But something felt off. The first officer noticed that the engines weren't accelerating as expected. He voiced his concerns, but the captain dismissed them. The aircraft continued down the icy runway, struggling to gain speed. Then, the moment of no return, the wheels left the ground. But the aircraft was climbing too slowly. The pilots could feel the jet struggling. It wasn't gaining altitude like it should. The engines weren't producing enough power, and the airspeed was dangerously low. Seconds later, alarms blared in the cockpit. The plane was stalling. Before the pilots could react, the nose of the aircraft pitched downward. The Boeing 737 plummeted back toward the ground, heading straight for Washington's 14th Street Bridge, filled with rush-hour traffic. What happened next was a disaster unlike anything Washington, D.C. had ever seen. The moment Air Florida Flight 90 lifted off the icy runway, it was already doomed. The engines weren't producing enough power, and the aircraft struggled to climb. Inside the cockpit, alarm bells were going off, but it was already too late. The Boeing 737 was supposed to gain altitude and stabilize, but instead it began to sink back toward the city below. The pilots pulled back on the controls, desperately trying to keep the plane in the air, but the aircraft was too slow and too heavy. Ice had built up on the wings and inside the engines, choking the power they needed to climb. At 4:01 p.m., just 30 seconds after takeoff, the aircraft was at an altitude of only 352 feet, far too low for a safe climb. The cockpit voice recorder captured the pilot's final moments of realization. First Officer Pettit: "God, look at that thing." "That doesn't seem right, does it?" Captain Wheaton: "Yes, it is. There's 80 knots. First Officer Pettit: "No way!" The speed wasn't increasing. The plane was moving too slow to stay in the air, and within seconds it entered a deadly stall. Suddenly, the nose of the aircraft dipped downward. The engines, already weakened by ice, couldn't generate the thrust needed to recover. Gravity took over. The plane dropped rapidly, heading straight for Washington's 14th Street Bridge. Down below, Washington, D.C. was in the middle of rush hour. Cars filled the bridge, drivers unaware that a massive aircraft was falling from the sky above them. At 4:01 p.m., in a terrifying instant, Flight 90 slammed into the bridge at nearly 400 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft's wings sliced through cars like paper, crushing vehicles and killing drivers instantly. 4 people on the bridge lost their lives in the explosion of metal, fire, and debris. The plane, now out of control, broke apart upon impact. But it didn't stop there. After striking the bridge, the remains of Flight 90 plunged into the icy Potomac River. Passengers who had survived the initial crash were now trapped inside it. Now the race was on, not just to figure out why the plane had crashed, but to save those still alive in the icy river. The next moments would become one of the most incredible survival stories ever witnessed. The wreckage of Air Florida Flight 90 now lay in the frozen waters of the Potomac River. a chilling scene of devastation. The aircraft had smashed into the 14th Street Bridge, crushing cars and killing 4 people on the ground before breaking apart and plunging into the icy river. But for those who had survived the initial impact, a new nightmare was just beginning. The temperature in Washington, D.C. that day was a brutal 24 degrees Fahrenheit, -4 degrees Celsius, and the river was covered in thick sheets of ice. The few survivors who had managed to escape the sinking wreckage now found themselves fighting for their lives in the freezing water. From the shore, stunned onlookers watched in horror as passengers and crew members struggled to stay afloat. Most of them were injured, bleeding, and already suffering from shock. The cold was merciless. Every second in the water brought them closer to hypothermia and death. Emergency responders rushed to the scene, but there was one massive problem. The river was frozen over, making it nearly impossible for boats to reach the survivors. The ice was too thick for boats to push through, but too thin for rescuers to walk on. The situation was growing more desperate by the second. And then something extraordinary happened. A news helicopter, filming the crash from above, suddenly became the only hope for those trapped in the freezing river. The pilot, Donald Usher, and his partner, paramedic Gene Windsor, made a split-second decision. They would attempt a mid-air rescue, something that had never been done before. Hovering just feet above the ice, the helicopter crew lowered a lifeline to the first survivor they could reach, a flight attendant named Kelly Duncan. She grabbed the rope and was pulled to safety, but there were still others clinging to floating wreckage, too weak to pull themselves up. Then a man in the water did something no one expected. Instead of taking the rescue rope for himself, he passed it to another survivor. Over and over, he gave up his chance to be saved, helping others first. This unknown man would later become known as the hero of the Potomac. But as the helicopter crew worked frantically, the cold tightened its deadly grip. Survivors were becoming too weak to hold on, slipping under the water. One woman, flight attendant Priscilla Tirado, was in shock and unable to grab the rope. She cried out for help, but her strength was gone. That's when a bystander on the shore, Lenny Skutnik, did something incredible. Without hesitation, he jumped into the freezing water, swam to Priscilla, and dragged her to safety. The rescue efforts were heroic, but they couldn't save everyone. As the last survivor was pulled from the water, one person was missing, the hero of the Potomac. The man who had selflessly given up his chance to survive was gone, swallowed by the icy river. The world had witnessed unbelievable courage in the face of tragedy. But now the focus turned to why this disaster had even happened in the first place. Investigators were about to uncover a deadly chain of mistakes that doomed Flight 90 from the start. As the last survivor was pulled from the freezing Potomac River, the world was left in shock. Air Florida Flight 90 had been a routine flight, but within minutes of takeoff, it had slammed into a busy bridge and crashed into icy waters. The death toll was staggering. 74 passengers, 4 crew members, and 4 people on the bridge had lost their lives. But now the question everyone was asking was, why? At first, many suspected engine failure. The plane had barely gained altitude before it fell back to the ground. But as investigators arrived at the scene and started recovering the wreckage, they found something strange. Both engines were still intact. There was no sign of an explosion, no major mechanical malfunction, and no clear reason why the engines had failed to generate enough power. That's when the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, was recovered. Investigators knew that the answers they needed were inside that black box. As they listened to the final minutes before the crash, they uncovered a chilling reality. This disaster had been preventable. The first shocking discovery, the pilots had ignored multiple warning signs. During the taxi, First Officer Roger Pettit had noticed that something felt off. He had pointed out that the engine readings weren't matching normal takeoff performance, but Captain Larry Wheaton dismissed his concerns. CVR recording, moments before takeoff. First Officer Pettit, "God, look at that thing. That doesn't seem right, does it?" Captain Wheaton, "Yes, it is. There's 80 knots. First Officer Pettit, "No way." The aircraft was not accelerating as it should have been. Something was robbing the engines of power. Then came the second chilling discovery. The pilots had failed to activate the engine anti-ice system. Investigators found that ice had built up inside the engines, choking the airflow and severely reducing thrust. This meant that even though the pilots pushed the throttles forward, the engines couldn't deliver the power they needed. To make things worse, ice had also formed on the wings. Aircraft wings are designed to generate lift by smoothly guiding air over their surface. But when ice builds up, it disrupts the airflow, making it harder for the plane to stay in the air. This is exactly what happened to Flight 90. It was too slow, too heavy, and too iced up to climb. Then came the most devastating realization, and this could have been prevented. The aircraft had been de-iced before departure, but the pilots had waited too long before taking off. New ice had accumulated, but they never requested another round of de-icing. The final mistake? The pilots failed to perform a critical engine test before takeoff, which would have revealed the ice buildup. Had they done this check, they would have known that the engines weren't producing enough power. One small decision after another had sealed the fate of Flight 90. Now the world wanted answers. How had these mistakes been allowed to happen? And what would be done to make sure this never happened again? Investigators were about to expose a series of deadly oversights that would change the future of winter flying forever. The investigation into Air Florida Flight 90 was now in full swing. The wreckage had been pulled from the icy Potomac River, the black box had been recovered, and investigators had uncovered chilling evidence of pilot errors. But now they had to answer the bigger question. How had such a preventable disaster been allowed to happen? As the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, pieced together the final moments before the crash, they found that multiple factors had led to the tragedy. It wasn't just one mistake. It was a deadly chain of errors. The first critical mistake was the failure to properly de-ice the aircraft. On the day of the crash, Washington National Airport was experiencing a major snowstorm. Planes were covered in ice, and de-icing crews were struggling to keep up. Flight 90 had been sprayed with de-icing fluid, but then it sat on the taxiway for 45 minutes before taking off. Fresh ice had formed, but the pilots never requested a second de-icing. This meant that when the plane took off, its wings were already covered in a thin but deadly layer of ice. Then came the second major mistake. The pilots did not use the engine anti-ice system. The Boeing 737 is equipped with an anti-ice system that prevents ice from forming inside the engines. It is mandatory to turn it on in freezing conditions. But for some reason, the pilots left it off. This decision crippled the engines, preventing them from reaching full power. Even though the pilots pushed the throttles forward, the engines were choked by ice and couldn't generate enough thrust. The third mistake was the failure to do a simple engine test before takeoff. There is a basic procedure called the engine run-up test, where pilots briefly increase power to make sure the engines are working properly. This test is especially important in cold weather because it helps remove ice buildup. But Captain Wheaton and First Officer Pettit skipped this check. Had they done it, they would have seen that the engines weren't delivering full thrust. Then came the final, most devastating mistake, ignoring the warning signs. As the aircraft rolled down the runway, the first officer noticed that something was wrong. The plane was not accelerating fast enough. CVR recording, moments before takeoff. First Officer Pettit, "That doesn't seem right, does it, Captain Wheaton?" "Yes, it is. There's 80 knots. First Officer Pettit, "No way." But instead of aborting the takeoff, the captain pushed forward, and 30 seconds later, Flight 90 was falling from the sky. The investigation revealed that this crash could have been entirely avoided. The aircraft was fully functional, the engines were in working order, and if the correct procedures had been followed, everyone on board would have landed safely in Florida. This was a disaster caused not by mechanical failure, but by human error. Now, the aviation industry faces a serious problem. If pilots and airlines weren't properly trained to handle winter conditions, how many other planes were at risk? The NTSB was about to make recommendations that would forever change the way airlines operate in freezing weather. The lessons learned from this tragedy would save countless lives, but they had come at a terrible cost. The investigation into Air Florida Flight 90 had confirmed the worst. This disaster was entirely preventable. The aircraft itself was in perfect working condition, yet it had failed to climb, stalled, and crashed into a crowded bridge before sinking into the freezing Potomac River. Now, the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, had to determine how to prevent this from happening again. They needed to understand why the pilots had made these deadly mistakes and how the aviation industry could stop similar accidents in the future. One of the most troubling discoveries was that Air Florida pilots were not properly trained to operate in extreme winter conditions. The airline's policies didn't emphasize the dangers of ice buildup. Pilots were given basic de-icing procedures, but they were not thoroughly trained on how even a thin layer of ice could affect a plane's ability to fly. First Officer Roger Pettit recognized something was wrong, but Captain Larry Wheaton ignored it. This raised a serious issue. Why did the co-pilot feel like he couldn't challenge the captain's decision? The run-up test was skipped. Had the pilots briefly tested the engines before takeoff, they would have seen that they weren't generating full power. But they didn't, and no one questioned it. These mistakes weren't just small miscalculations. They were fatal errors that stemmed from gaps in training, poor decision-making, and a dangerous airline culture. The NTSB discovered another critical factor. There was a major problem with cockpit communication. In 1982, aviation culture was still very hierarchical, meaning that co-pilots often didn't feel comfortable questioning their captains. First Officer Pettit clearly saw that the engine readings were abnormal. He pointed it out, but Captain Wheaton dismissed his concerns. Instead of pushing the issue, Pettit backed down. He likely didn't want to challenge his captain in the middle of takeoff. This issue was not unique to Air Florida. It was a global problem. Many aviation accidents had been linked to co-pilots who noticed problems but didn't speak up because they feared contradicting their captains. The crash of Flight 90 made it clear. This culture had to change. In response to the crash, the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, implemented major changes in aviation training and cockpit procedures. Airlines were now required to follow stricter de-icing procedures. Pilots were trained to recognize the impact of ice buildup on aircraft performance. If a plane waited too long after de-icing, it had to be de-iced again. No exceptions. Airlines introduced CRM, Cockpit Resource Management training, which emphasized better communication between captains and co-pilots. Co-pilots were now encouraged to speak up if they saw something wrong. Captains were trained to listen and take concerns seriously. Every voice in the cockpit mattered. These changes revolutionized aviation safety. Today, cockpit teamwork is a priority, and pilots undergo extensive winter operations training to prevent disasters like Flight 90. Despite all the advancements, winter weather is still a major risk for aircraft today. In 2017, a Pegasus Airlines flight in Turkey skidded off an icy runway, nearly falling into the ocean. In 2019, a Canada-bound Boeing 737 slid off the runway in icy conditions, narrowly avoiding disaster. If de-icing procedures aren't followed correctly, even modern planes can still be in danger. The lessons of Air Florida Flight 90 saved countless lives, but the question remains, have we learned enough to prevent another tragedy? Because as history has shown, aviation safety improves only when disaster forces us to change. As the investigation into Air Florida Flight 90 continued, it became clear that the disaster was not just a result of bad weather or mechanical failure. It was a chain of human errors, misjudgments, and poor decision-making. While the pilot's mistakes were at the center of the crash, investigators also began looking at the airline's policies, air traffic control decisions, and the overall handling of winter operations at Washington National Airport. What they found was disturbing. One of the biggest issues was that Air Florida was an inexperienced airline when it came to operating in extreme winter conditions. Unlike larger airlines that had decades of experience flying in cold climates, Air Florida had a weak winter training program for its pilots. The airline rushed its expansion without ensuring that its crews were adequately trained for ice and snow operations. This lack of training contributed to the pilots' failure to recognize the signs of ice buildup on their aircraft. Another alarming issue was the airport's ground operations. On the day of the crash, de-icing procedures were rushed due to the high number of delayed flights. Air Florida 90 was de-iced, but the ground crew used improper techniques. Instead of fully clearing the aircraft, they left behind a layer of slush and ice that would later interfere with the plane's performance. Even worse, because the flight was stuck on the taxiway for 45 minutes before takeoff, new ice had already started forming. The pilots should have requested another de-icing session, but they didn't. They assumed the previous de-icing was still effective, a fatal miscalculation. Investigators also looked at air traffic control's role in the disaster. They discovered that the flight had taken off right behind another departing aircraft, and the pilots had made an unusual decision. They attempted to use the previous plane's exhaust to clear ice from their wings. This was a dangerous and unproven method. Instead of waiting for another round of de-icing, the pilots believed that the hot jet blast from the plane ahead of them would melt the ice on their wings. But in reality, this only made things worse. The heat temporarily melted some ice, but it quickly refroze, making the wings even more dangerous just before takeoff. With all these factors combined, Flight 90 was doomed before it even left the runway. The pilots' misjudgments, lack of training, rushed de-icing, and failed procedures all stacked up to create the perfect storm for disaster. The final piece of evidence came from the cockpit voice recorder. When investigators played back the last few minutes before takeoff, they heard the first officer repeatedly questioning the aircraft's performance. He noticed that the engine power was unusually low, and he hinted at his concern multiple times. But Captain Wheaton ignored him, convinced that everything was normal. This moment highlighted a serious problem in aviation at the time. Co-pilots often felt unable to challenge their captains. The hierarchical structure in cockpits meant that even when first officers noticed something was wrong, they sometimes remained silent out of fear of questioning authority. This issue wasn't unique to Air Florida. Many aviation disasters had been caused by cockpit culture that discouraged junior pilots from speaking up. This crash was about to change that forever. The aviation industry could no longer ignore these problems. If something wasn't done, another plane would eventually crash for the same reasons. Now the world demanded change. Investigators were about to make groundbreaking recommendations that would reshape the future of commercial aviation. The crash of Air Florida Flight 90 was a wake-up call for the entire aviation industry. This was not just a freak accident, it was a preventable tragedy caused by human error, lack of training, and poor decision-making. The mistakes made that day could have been avoided, and investigators were determined to ensure that nothing like this ever happened again. One of the most urgent issues that needed to be addressed was pilot training. The investigation revealed that many pilots were not adequately trained to handle winter conditions. Ice buildup on the wings and engines was one of the most dangerous hazards in aviation, yet many flight crews were not taught how to properly identify or respond to it. The failure to use the engine anti-ice system and the incorrect assumption that de-icing had been sufficient were clear signs that pilots needed better training for cold weather operations. The FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, responded quickly by overhauling de-icing procedures and winter training programs for all commercial airlines. New rules were put in place that required more thorough de-icing of aircraft before takeoff and prohibited extended wait times after de-icing without rechecking for ice buildup. Pilots were now required to run specific engine checks before takeoff in icy conditions to ensure that their aircraft was producing full thrust. One of the most groundbreaking changes that resulted from this crash was the introduction of cockpit resource management (CRM) training. Before this, aviation culture was highly hierarchical, meaning captains had ultimate authority and co-pilots were often hesitant to challenge their decisions. The cockpit voice recorder from Flight 90 proved that First Officer Roger Pettit knew something was wrong, but he didn't push back hard enough against Captain Wheaton's decisions. This same problem had been identified in other aviation disasters, including the Tenerife Airport disaster in 1977, where lack of clear communication between pilots led to the deadliest crash in history. CRM training completely changed how pilots interacted in the cockpit. It empowered co-pilots to speak up if they noticed something wrong and required captains to take their concerns seriously. Instead of relying solely on seniority, pilots were now trained to work as a team. This one change alone has saved countless lives by ensuring that flight crews operate with open communication and shared decision-making. The crash also highlighted the need for better coordination between airlines and air traffic control. Flight 90 had taken off too soon after another plane, and the pilots had attempted a risky maneuver by using the jet blast from the previous aircraft to remove ice. This was completely untested and unsafe, yet nothing prevented them from doing it. As a result, stricter guidelines were introduced for runway spacing and aircraft departure timing in winter conditions. The changes that came from this investigation transformed aviation safety forever. The lessons learned from this disaster directly influenced modern flight training, winter weather procedures, and cockpit communication. Today, pilots are far better prepared to handle icy conditions, speak up when something feels wrong, and make decisions as a team rather than deferring to a single authority figure. But while the changes made aviation safer, the question still remained: could a similar accident happen again? The answer was unsettling. Despite all the advancements, weather-related crashes were still happening. Investigators now had to look ahead and ask themselves, what other dangers were still lurking in the skies? And how many more disasters would it take before the next big change was made? Despite the major changes in aviation safety that followed the crash of Air Florida Flight 90, one question remained: could something like this happen again? With all the advancements in technology, training, and weather monitoring, was the aviation industry truly prepared for extreme winter conditions? The short answer? Air travel is safer than ever, but weather-related crashes can still happen. Over the years, there have been several close calls and deadly accidents caused by winter weather, ice buildup, and poor decision-making. Even with all the new regulations and safety procedures, there are still unpredictable dangers that can threaten an aircraft. In 1992, Air Interflight 148 crashed into a mountainside during its approach to Strasbourg, France. Snowy weather and poor visibility caused confusion in the cockpit, leading to a deadly miscalculation. The aircraft struck the ground just 20 miles from the airport, killing 87 people. In 2005, an Air France Airbus A340 attempted to land in Toronto during a severe thunderstorm. Heavy rain reduced visibility to near zero, and the aircraft skidded off the runway, crashing into a ravine. Miraculously, everyone survived, but the crash proved that even modern technology can't always protect against extreme weather conditions. One of the most recent and alarming incidents happened in 2009 with Colgan Air Flight 3407. The aircraft was on approach to Buffalo, New York in icy conditions. The pilots failed to respond correctly to a stall warning, and the aircraft plunged into a residential area, killing all 49 people on board. Investigators later found that the pilots were fatigued and not properly trained to handle icy conditions. This case was eerily similar to Air Florida Flight 90. Preventable mistakes in winter weather led to disaster. These incidents prove that even after decades of improvements, flying in winter conditions remains a challenge. Icing, poor visibility, wind shear, and pilot error are still major risks. But the difference today is that pilots are now much better trained to recognize and handle these dangers. Modern aircraft are equipped with advanced de-icing systems, better weather radar, and sensors that alert pilots if ice is forming on the wings or engines. Air traffic control also monitors weather conditions more closely, making sure that aircraft do not take off in unsafe conditions. Perhaps the biggest change has been in pilot training. After the lessons learned from Flight 90, pilots are now trained to detect icing issues, conduct thorough pre-flight checks, and speak up if something doesn't feel right. The implementation of Cockpit Resource Management (CRM) means that captains no longer have absolute authority. Co-pilots are encouraged to voice concerns, and teamwork is a priority. Even with these improvements, the aviation industry can never afford to be complacent. Weather-related crashes still happen, and every new incident forces experts to reevaluate safety measures. Air Florida Flight 90 was a wake-up call that led to major safety advancements, but history has shown that aviation disasters often reveal hidden weaknesses that must be addressed. The final question remains: what unknown dangers still exist? Will it take another tragic accident for the next big change to happen? The crash of Flight 90 taught the world a valuable lesson. Aviation safety must always evolve, or history will repeat itself. The crash of Air Florida Flight 90 was more than just a tragic accident. It was a preventable disaster that changed aviation forever. What should have been a routine flight to Florida turned into a national tragedy, killing 78 people, including passengers, crew, and drivers on the bridge. But beyond the heartbreak and devastation, this crash forced the aviation industry to confront serious flaws in winter operations, pilot training, and cockpit communication. The crash of Air Florida Flight 90 was more than just a tragic accident. It was a preventable disaster that changed aviation forever. What should have been a routine flight to Florida turned into a national tragedy, killing 78 people, including passengers, crew, and drivers on the bridge. But beyond the heartbreak and devastation, this crash forced the aviation industry to confront serious flaws in winter operations, pilot training, and cockpit communication. The investigation revealed the harsh truth. This was not a random act of fate. A deadly chain of human errors had led to the disaster. The pilots failed to use the engine anti-ice system, didn't request a second de-icing, and ignored warning signs before takeoff. The first officer recognized something was wrong, but didn't challenge his captain forcefully enough. The airline didn't provide strong winter weather training, and the airport's de-icing procedures were rushed due to delays. Because of this crash, aviation safety changed forever. The FAA introduced stricter de-icing rules, mandatory engine checks in freezing weather, and better pilot training for winter conditions. But the biggest change was the introduction of Cockpit Resource Management, CRM. No longer were co-pilots expected to blindly follow their captains. They were trained to speak up, challenge bad decisions, and work as a team. This one change has saved countless lives and prevented many potential crashes. Today, the impact of Flight 90 is still felt in every cockpit, every winter flight, and every pilot training session. But despite all these advancements, one chilling question remains. What other hidden dangers still exist? History has shown that aviation safety only improves after tragedy forces change. If there are new threats in the skies today, will we act before disaster strikes again? Or will it take another tragedy to push the industry forward once more? What do you think? Could something like this still happen today, or have we finally made air travel safe enough? Let us know in the comments. Like this video if you believe aviation safety should always be a top priority. Subscribe to Crash Plan Diaries for more shocking aviation disasters, investigations, and survival stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss our latest deep dive into aviation mysteries. Share this story to spread awareness, because understanding past disasters prevents future tragedies. Aviation has come a long way, but one truth remains. If we fail to learn from history, we are doomed to repeat it.